Core philosophical principles. Reality responds lawfully rather than morally. The first principle of this framework is that reality does not need to be understood as a moral judge. Reality responds. It does not necessarily reward the good because they are good, nor punish the bad because they are bad. It operates through relationships between conditions, actions, structures, capacities, and consequences. Fire burns regardless of the moral character of the person who touches it. Gravity operates regardless of intention. The body responds to its environment according to its structure. Likewise, consciousness encounters the consequences of its relationship with reality according to lawful processes. This does not mean morality is meaningless. Dharma remains profoundly important because conscious beings participate in relationships, and those relationships have consequences. But Dharma is not the same thing as a cosmic courtroom. The distinction is between moral judgment and lawful correspondence. If consciousness repeatedly acts from anger, anger may reinforce certain patterns of perception and behavior. If consciousness acts from attachment, attachment may create recurring forms of friction. If consciousness develops discernment, different possibilities become accessible. Reality is responding to the structure of participation. This removes the need to imagine a cosmic authority constantly deciding who deserves what. The universe does not need to hate someone in order for a consequence to occur. A consequence can simply follow from the structure of the interaction. This makes reality less like a courtroom and more like an intricate web of causation. The practical consequence is profound. Instead of asking, "What did I do to deserve this?" consciousness can ask, "What conditions produce this experience, and what is the experience revealing?" The first question searches for judgment, the second searches for understanding. Consciousness cannot express beyond its present structural capacity. Consciousness can only express through the capacities currently available to it. This is the capacity principle. At any given moment, consciousness operates through a particular configuration of perception, memory, conditioning, knowledge, embodiment, emotional structure, attention, and awareness. That configuration determines what can be perceived. What can be perceived influences what can be understood. What can be understood influences what can be chosen. And what can be chosen influences what can be expressed. The individual, therefore, cannot simply access every possible response at every moment. A possibility that is invisible to consciousness cannot function as an available choice. A capacity that has not developed cannot simply be commanded into existence. This explains why two people can encounter the same circumstance and respond completely differently. The circumstance is shared. The structure of consciousness is not. One person may possess the discernment necessary to recognize an opportunity. Another may perceive only threat. One may be capable of restraint. Another may be overwhelmed by impulse. One may understand the deeper pattern. Another may only experience the immediate emotion. Neither response needs to be explained through absolute moral superiority. They emerge from different capacities. This principle also explains development. Learning changes structure. Practice changes capacity. Experience changes perception. Insight changes accessibility. As consciousness develops, possibilities that were previously unavailable become available. The person does not merely acquire information. They become a different instrument through which consciousness can operate. This is why spiritual development is fundamentally developmental. The goal is not simply to collect teachings, it is to become capable of embodying what those teachings reveal. Apparent free will is the lived perception of consciousness unfolding through its current level of awareness. Human beings experience themselves as choosing. This experience is undeniable. We deliberate, we hesitate, we decide, we act. From inside consciousness, choice feels immediate and personal. Yet the experience of choosing does not necessarily prove that consciousness exists outside causation. A decision emerges from the total configuration present at the moment of decision. The body has a particular condition. The mind contains particular impressions. Memory supplies particular information. Desire has a particular intensity. Fear has particular associations. Understanding has reached a particular level. Circumstances provide particular possibilities. The resulting action emerges from this configuration. This does not make choice meaningless. It changes what choice means. Rather than imagining free will as absolute independence from causation, agency can be understood as the capacity of consciousness to participate within causation. The more developed consciousness becomes, the more possibilities become accessible. Freedom therefore increases through development. A person who has no awareness of a pattern cannot consciously interrupt it. A person who recognizes the pattern has gained another degree of freedom. A person who understands its mechanism gains another. A person who has integrated the lesson may no longer be compelled by it. The movement is therefore not from total bondage to absolute independence. It is from unconscious participation toward conscious participation. This allows determinism and development to coexist. The process can be lawful while still being transformative. The individual does not need to control the entire universe to become increasingly free. They need to become increasingly conscious of the structure through which they participate in it. Hindsight creates the illusion that different choices were previously available. One of the strongest arguments for ordinary free will comes from looking backward. A person remembers a decision and thinks, I could have chosen differently. But the person making that judgment now is not identical in informational and psychological structure to the person who made the original decision. Time has added knowledge. Experience has added understanding. Consequences have revealed information. The person has changed. The later consciousness, therefore, looks backward with capacities that were not necessarily available to the earlier consciousness. This creates the retrospective illusion. The present self reconstructs the past using information that did not exist in the past. An outcome becomes known. Its consequences become visible. Alternative possibilities become imaginable. The mind then projects those possibilities backward and concludes that they were equally accessible at the time. But possibility in imagination is not the same as accessibility in consciousness. A person may now see 10 possible responses to an event that at the time they genuinely experienced as having only one. The other 9 possibilities existed conceptually. They did not necessarily exist psychologically as accessible actions. This distinction allows compassion to enter the understanding of karma. The purpose is not to excuse harmful behavior. It is to understand how behavior emerges. The person who acted from ignorance did not possess the knowledge they later acquired. The person who reacted from fear did not yet possess the stability they later developed. The person who made a destructive decision may later become capable of recognizing exactly why that decision arose. The past cannot be changed by the consciousness that exists now, but the understanding acquired now can change what becomes possible next. This is why hindsight is valuable when used for learning, but dangerous when used for self-condemnation. The correct question is not, why wasn't I already the person I became later? It is, what did that experience make possible for consciousness to understand now? Biology, psychology, culture, history, relationships, and circumstance are components of one unified cosmic curriculum. Consciousness does not encounter reality in isolation. It enters a field of conditions, a particular body, a particular nervous system, a particular family, a particular culture, a particular historical period, a particular geographical environment, a particular psychological temperament, a particular network of relationships, a particular sequence of experiences. These factors are often treated as separate influences. Within this framework, they can instead be understood as interconnected components of one developmental field. Biology determines certain capacities and limitations. Psychology shapes perception and response. Culture provides concepts, values, assumptions, and social structures. History determines which possibilities exist within a particular era. Relationships create mirrors through which consciousness encounters itself. Circumstances provide the specific conditions in which these structures interact. The curriculum is therefore not simply a series of isolated lessons. It is an ecosystem. A single experience may contain biological, psychological, relational, cultural, and karmic dimensions simultaneously. This is why reducing an experience to one cause can produce an incomplete understanding. The curriculum operates through the interaction of many conditions. Birth itself becomes philosophically significant within this model. The circumstances into which consciousness enters provide the initial parameters of its developmental field: family, body, temperament, environment, historical era, social conditions, opportunities, limitations, relationships. These do not necessarily represent punishment. They form the starting configuration. From there, consciousness encounters experience and develops through it. This also explains why no two incarnations need to follow the same developmental path. Different configurations produce different lessons. Different capacities require different environments. Different consciousnesses encounter different forms of friction. The curriculum is therefore individualized without necessarily being arbitrary. It is lawful precisely because that the conditions correspond to the structure moving through them. Archons are best understood as administrators of lawful order rather than malevolent jailers. The concept of the archon occupies an unusual position in modern spiritual thought. The term has increasingly become associated with cosmic imprisonment, manipulation, deception, and hostile intelligences that prevent consciousness from escaping the material world. This book proposes another interpretation. The word itself carries the sense of ruler, authority, or administrator. Within the philosophical model developed here, the archonic principle represents the administration of lawful order. This does not require assuming that every being described as an archon in every historical tradition had precisely the same nature or function. The purpose here is conceptual. If reality is structured, then some principle of administration would logically correspond to that structure. Order requires boundaries. Boundaries require regulation. Regulation requires some form of administration. The administrator, therefore, does not have to be understood as an enemy. A teacher restricts a student from using equipment they are not prepared to handle. A guardian restricts access to danger. A governing system establishes rules. A cosmic administrator within this model maintains the conditions through which the curriculum operates. This changes the spiritual objective. The goal is not to defeat the archons. It is to understand the order they administer. As consciousness develops, its relationship with administration changes. What once appeared restrictive may become intelligible. What once required external regulation may eventually become internally governed through understanding. The highest form of freedom is therefore not rebellion against law. It is conscious alignment with reality's lawful structure. The administrator becomes unnecessary, not because the administrator has been destroyed, but because the consciousness no longer requires the same degree of external restriction. Karma is correspondence, not reward or punishment. Karma is often imagined as a cosmic accounting system. Good actions create positive credits. Bad actions create negative debts. Life then becomes a process through which the universe balances the account. This interpretation can make karma frightening. It can also reduce an extraordinarily complex principle to a simplistic system of reward and punishment. The framework developed in this book understands karma differently. Karma is correspondence. Consciousness interacts with reality. That interaction generates consequences. Those consequences generate experience. Experience modifies consciousness. Modified consciousness then encounters reality differently. The process continues. Karma therefore describes a dynamic relationship between consciousness and circumstance. It does not require a judge, it requires lawful interaction. This is why the same external event can have radically different karmic significance for different consciousnesses. An experience may reinforce attachment in one person and dissolve attachment in another. It may produce fear in one person and discernment in another. It may strengthen identification in one person and generate detachment in another. The experience itself is only one part of the equation. The structure encountering it matters. This also explains why karmic patterns can repeat. If consciousness remains structurally similar, the same types of correspondence can continue. When consciousness changes, the correspondence changes. The karmic lesson therefore ends not simply because enough suffering has been endured. It ends because understanding has altered the structure producing the pattern. Karma is consequently not something consciousness must fear. It is something consciousness can learn to read. Every recurring pattern becomes information. Every consequence becomes feedback. Every friction becomes an opportunity to examine the relationship between consciousness and reality. Spiritual evolution occurs through understanding, integration, and expansion of consciousness rather than escaping a cosmic prison. The final principle brings the entire framework together. Spiritual evolution is not fundamentally an escape project. It is a developmental process. Consciousness begins within limitation. It encounters experience. Experience produces friction. Friction exposes structure. Structure becomes visible. Visibility creates understanding. Understanding produces integration. Integration expands capacity. Expanded capacity allows consciousness to inhabit a wider field of experience. The process continues. This is evolution through consciousness. The goal is therefore not simply to leave Earth. It is not merely to escape the body. It is not to defeat the matrix. It is not to overthrow cosmic administrators. It is not to accumulate spiritual status. The deeper movement is toward understanding, understanding oneself, understanding perception, understanding karma, understanding desire, understanding attachment, understanding limitation, understanding the relationship between consciousness and circumstance, understanding the architecture of manifestation, and ultimately, understanding the nature of consciousness itself. Within the Indic framework, this movement resonates with the progressive refinement of awareness described through yoga, dharma, jnana, and moksha. The outer conditions may change. The inner relationship with those conditions changes more fundamentally. A person who once experienced limitation as imprisonment may eventually experience it as structure. A person who once experienced karma as punishment may recognize correspondence. A person who once experienced friction as failure may recognize instruction. A person who once searched for enemies may begin searching for understanding. A person who once wanted to escape reality may begin seeing reality as the field through which consciousness learned to recognize itself. This is the transition from resistance to participation, and participation eventually gives way to integration. The curriculum has done its work when consciousness no longer needs to be forced into understanding through repetition. The lesson has become part of the structure. The boundary becomes unnecessary. The friction dissolves. The field expands. And the consciousness that once experienced itself as trapped begins to recognize that liberation was never simply a matter of leaving the field. It was a matter of awakening within it. The principles taken together. Taken individually, these principles describe different aspects of the human experience. Taken together, they form a single philosophical architecture. Reality responds through lawful correspondence rather than arbitrary judgment. Consciousness operates according to its present structural capacity. What appears as choice emerges from the conditions presently accessible to awareness. Hindsight reconstructs the past using capacities acquired afterward. Birth and circumstance establish a particular developmental field. Karma describes the correspondence between consciousness and that field. Archonic administration represents the maintenance of lawful order. Friction exposes the structures that remain unresolved. Integration changes those structures. Expansion increases what consciousness can perceive, understand, and express. And eventually, the limitations that once defined the experience of reality become increasingly transparent. The entire system can therefore be expressed as a developmental sequence. Structure creates limitation. Limitation creates experience. Experience creates friction. Friction reveals structure. Recognition creates understanding. Understanding creates integration. Integration expands consciousness. Expanded consciousness changes correspondence. Changed correspondence creates new fields of experience. And the curriculum continues until the consciousness has developed beyond the structures that originally defined its experience. The ultimate movement is therefore not from prison to escape. It is from unconscious limitation to conscious participation, from reaction to understanding, from identification to awareness, from friction to integration, from limitation to liberation.